Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Charlotte Davidson. I am the director of the Native American House. I'd like to extend a special, immense amount of gratitude to the College of Education for co-sponsoring this talk that is kickstarting our Native American Heritage Month series of events. Before we introduce the speakers, I'm going to hand it off to David Eby, who Sari wants to co-present. She wants to co-present. So David Eby and Yanaba Schroeder, they serve as Native American House ambassadors. And David is going to start us off with the recognition of place, and Yanaba will introduce our distinguished guests.
So I would like to begin today by recognizing and acknowledging that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these native nations prior to the forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. And as a land grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. We are also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years.
I would like to first introduce Dr. Stephanie Waterman. She is Onondaga, part of Turtle Clan, and the Associate Professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies at the University of Toronto. She is in Leadership, Higher, and Adult Education and coordinates the Student Development / Student Services and Higher Education stream. She's honored to work on the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and Mississaugas of the Credit. She is a mother, sister, auntie, and grandmother. Dr. Waterman researches Indigenous student experiences and associated support units and is currently using critical geography to do so. She's a co-editor with her colleagues, Dr. Heather J. Shotton and Shelley C. Lowe of Beyond the Asterisk, Understanding Native Students in Higher Education. And then she's also Beyond Access Indigenizing Programs for Native Student Success in 2018. Dr. Waterman is in the profession to educate those who work with Indigenous students and those who teach student and academic affairs personnel about Indigenous students so that our students will have better, more fulfilling experiences in college. Thank you for being here today. And I'd like to also introduce Dr. Heather Shotton, who is a citizen of the Wichita and affiliated tribes and a Kiowa and Cheyenne descendant. She serves as the Vice President of Diversity Affairs at Fort Lewis College, a Native American serving non-tribal institution situated in Durango, Colorado. Prior to joining Fort Lewis, she served as the Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies and the Director of Indigenous Education. She is in the initiative in the Jean Rainbolt College of Education and the University of Oklahoma. Dr. Shotton's scholarship engages with Indigenous higher education, Indigenous colleague students, and Indigenous feminism in academia. Her scholarship and practice has been dedicated to bring visibility to Indigenous people and issues in higher education and transforming higher education as a site of reclamation for Indigenous communities. She served as a co-editor for 4 critical books that address Indigenous higher education: Beyond the Asterisk, Understanding Native Students in Higher Education, Reclaiming Indigenous Research in Higher Education, and Beyond Access, Indigenizing Programs for Native American Student Success, and Indigenous Motherhood in the Academy. Her most recent co-edited work with Stephanie Waterman, Shelley Lowe, and Natalia Youngbull, Developments Beyond the Asterisk, New Scholarship and Frameworks for Understanding Native Students in Higher Education, which revisit the foundational work of Beyond the Asterisk. Dr. Shotton is a strong advocate for Indigenous education and has spent her career advocating for Indigenous students and communities and educational systems. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you. What do we say? Just to thank you for having us here today. And we're going to share a little bit about why this place is so important to us.
Thank you all for that embarrassing introduction. I always feel like we should share other things about ourselves. I'll share something about Stephanie. She loves potato chips, and I love gummy bears. So a little less academic for all of you. But thank you all for having us today as you kick off Native American Heritage Month. And as we prepare ourselves for the release of developments beyond the asterisk, new scholarship and frameworks for understanding Native students in higher education. University of Illinois serves as a really special place for us, and the work that Stephanie and Shelley and I have engaged over the last 15-ish years, somewhere around there, because it began here. And so it's fitting that that we return as we begin the revisiting of Beyond the Asterisk. As we situate ourselves here today and think about place and land, we're always reminded that this quote from Joseph Pierce that reminds us that land does not require that you confirm it exists or that it has been stolen. Rather, that you reciprocate the care that it has given to you. And so as we return here to the University of Illinois, we want to situate this place for us and the care that it gave to the beginnings of our scholarship and a critical journey for Indigenous higher education scholarship for many of us. So as we think about that, I don't know how many of you know that Beyond the Asterisk, which was came out just 10 years ago, was birthed right here at the University of Illinois. And I think that it represents a coming together of Indigenous scholars, emerging scholars, professionals, and advocates who were fighting for recognition of place. And so many of you may recognize some of these rooms. It began in 2007, but even before that, and we shared some of this, so sorry for the folks who were with us this morning. We shared some of this about our journey as sisters, as scholars, and as a higher education community that really began in a time where there was a lack of representation of Indigenous people in the scholarship in general, and particularly in higher education scholarship. And we found each other in places like professional organizations, as many of us were maybe the only person in our graduate programs or in our institutions, or we were a part of a select few or very few people. We also recognize that as we were engaging in our scholarship as emerging scholars, that there was really a lack of representation of our voices. Much of what had been written about Indigenous people was written by non-Indigenous people from a deficit approach. And beyond that, really there was a history of invisibilizing Indigenous people in higher education and the higher education scholarship. And so we found each other in places like the Association for the Study of Higher Education, and NASPA and ACPA and other student affairs professional organizations, where we found and built community over the years. And as we began to do that, there was an individual who was the director at that time of the Native American House here, Molly Springer, who invited us out to visit campus and to convene a number of us who were working in student affairs, who were emerging scholars, maybe in graduate programs, or there were some faculty members, but all of us were working to serve Indigenous students in one way or another. And there were a number of things that were happening on this campus and our collective campuses. And it was important for us to come together and just think and share community. And from that, there were a lot of really important conversations. And part of that conversation was this existence of the asterisk and the active writing out of Indigenous people in the higher ed scholarship. And so somewhere in that conversation, I think Dr. Waterman, who always reminds us that we have to tell our stories and we need to write about our stories. The idea of Beyond the Asterisk of a book came from that. And so it began, and it was a space that we wanted to invite those people who were on the front lines working with Indigenous students, those who, for many of us, were emerging scholars who were finishing our doctoral programs, or new scholars and established scholars, to come together and share our thoughts, our ideas, and about the work that we were doing. And it was about a 3-year process of co-creating this book in this space that became Beyond the Asterisk, that was released in 2013. So, and that brings us here 10 years later in 2023. And it was a few years ago that, again, Stephanie reminded us that we were coming up on the 10-year anniversary of the release of Beyond the Asterisk. And when we imagined this book, I don't think we ever imagined what the impact would be, or what it could be. And I don't think that we really knew at the time that we were dreaming new futures into existence, that we were dreaming into existence a future of higher education that centered Indigenous voices, that was written by and for Indigenous scholars. But luckily, that's what came out of that work. And so it felt appropriate 10 years later to revisit this work and to see where we've been. And over the years, it's been incredible to see the spaces where Beyond the Asterisk has taken hold in classrooms with graduate students, with undergrad students who at the time talked about not having seen themselves reflected in the scholarship before, and seeing themselves when they were able to pick up that book. To hear from community members who picked it up because they saw a representation of their family members, of their children, of their grandchildren, of their nieces and nephews, of their relatives that they had sent off to college, and to know that people were writing about these spaces and thinking about our responsibilities to serving Indigenous students. And so 10 years later, here we are. We have revisited Beyond the Asterisk, not in a second edition, but in an expanded anniversary edition that Dr. Waterman's going to talk a little bit more about, but really offered the opportunity to pick up the conversation and keep it moving forward, to address the things that we didn't know to think about when we first started talking about the possibility of a book, and topics that hadn't emerged yet, or that we hadn't recognized, to be able to reflect on the voices that we left out in that first piece, and to bring in the new scholars from that time, and all of the development and the growing body of Indigenous scholars across academia. And so Dr. Waterman's going to talk a little bit about that and help us to understand the framing of new developments in, I can never remember the title because we joke about all the different titles of the asterisk, but this new anniversary expanded edition.
You're gonna have to control that. Thank you. I want to say that when we first met to talk about the book too, we didn't think we were having how it would be used in the future. We just knew we needed it, and we needed to do it. And it's used in a lot of student affairs prep programs, which is something else we hadn't really thought of how it would be used, and still used today. I mean, we still get book sales, which 10 years later for a book that might be used in a master's program I think that's really unusual.
Can I add something really quick, Stephanie? So I think something that's important to note when we first approached our original publisher for this book and this idea, there was so little out there. And if you've ever worked with a publisher, the original thought was, well, is there an audience? Can we sell these books? And so, interestingly enough, and we ended up developing a really great relationship with Stylus and our editor, who became our publisher and editor over the years. But they weren't certain that there was going to be an audience for this book, that people would buy it. So would it be profitable? Would it be worth producing? And so the first run of the book, they ran a limited printing because they weren't sure. And within months, they were already moving to a second printing. That's how hungry people were. That's how hungry our community was for something that represented them in the scholarship. I always like to note that.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, that gives me great pleasure when I think back to that moment. Okay, so I'm going to overview like the literature review of the book and our introduction. And I need notes, which is why she has to have control of the clicker. So what's happened over the 10 years since 2013? And this has gone wacky. Okay, there's been such growth. We couldn't have imagined the growth. I mean, in my dreams, maybe 50 years down the road, we might have had this kind of growth that we have. So first, let's praise our original authors. 5 of our 2013 authors have earned doctorates. Several are faculty members, others have earned tenure, and some hold upper-level institutional administrative positions like college presidents and deanships. All of the chapters in our new text are written by Indigenous scholars. And again, we invited new scholars to contribute to this book. In 2013, we reported that over a 20-year period, 20 years, the 4 major higher education journals published 17 articles with an Indigenous focus over 20 years. In the same journals for the past 10 years, not 2010, we found 24 articles and 3 that, while not focusing specifically on Indigenous students, included them in their analysis. That's really unusual. In the past 10 years, we found over 116 Indigenous higher education articles. This is including those 4 and beyond. And several books have been published as well. Heather mentioned a few of them, and at least 50 dissertations. Such a wealth of knowledge. So I want to go over some definition of terms. In this book, we privilege Indigenous over terms such as Native American. Since 2013, Indigenous has become the term commonly used to identify ourselves and connect it to land and other Indigenous people. And it's a global connection. We mean indigenized when programs, literature, research, etc., come from our worldview for us in ways that privilege Indigenous values, knowledge, and perspectives. Like Native American and other terms, gay, lesbian, and LGBTQ plus two-spirit, for example, are imposed terms, not necessarily terms Indigenous communities would use. However, for many Indigenous people, two-spirit has become popular after the 1993 Native American First Nations Gay and Lesbian Conference in Winnipeg. It's important to note that not all Indigenous non-binary people identify as two-spirit, and that this term is not necessarily interchangeable with LGBTQ+. We suggest educating yourself regarding gender identity in Indigenous cultures. Tuck defines settler colonialism as a system that, quote, requires the destruction of Indigenous communities to clear the land for settlement. Through genocide, assimilation, appropriation, and state violence, Indigenous presence is erased, unquote. Literally, it's control over everything, and they're here to stay. The practice of sovereignty means Indigenous people have control over their lives, identities, traditions, and self-government. Lyons 2000 writes, quote, sovereignty denotes the right of a people to conduct its own affairs in its own place, in its own way, unquote. Indigenous knowledge systems, sometimes we refer to that as IKS, is defined as oral and written knowledge derived by Indigenous people through observation, innovation, practices, and beliefs developed through interaction and experiences with their environment. Next. So we're probably all familiar with the statistics people are always asking about, you know, how many Native students do you have on your campus? So in 2013, we reported that 1% of the total undergraduate population defined as Native American just 1%. 60% of that 1% identified as women. 30% of Native Americans aged 25 to 29 earned an associate's degree or higher, and less than 1% identified as faculty. Go to 2020, 2021, the total, it's dropped to 0.7% of undergraduate population who identify as Native. 65% identify as women. 23% that's gone down who earn an associate's or higher, and it's less than 1% who identify as faculty. However, this is based on self-identification, which does not necessarily mean one has tribal membership or if they are connected to community or trying to re-engage with their community. And this is aggregate data. Indigenous communities are diverse culturally and regionally. Burnett 2021 and Burnett and colleagues also 2021 discussed the undercounting in federal data after 2010, when Indigenous students who identified as Native and Hispanic were counted as Hispanic, and or Native and another race were counted as mixed. New development is that Indigenous statistics was not really a thing in 2013, but it is now. And chapter 2 in this book is about Indigenous statistics. And in there, they identify some Indigenous data sets. Okay, now. So what's changed in the past 10 years? A huge development is the beyond the scholarship, and that there are so many more Indigenous higher ed scholars, is the incorporation of Indigenous knowledge systems in the literature. Indigenous knowledge systems have been formed, was privileged in the development of programs, research, and relationships. So what is a knowledge system? It's what we know and how we come to know it. It's relational, contextual, and local. I'm going to say IKS instead of Indigenous knowledge systems all the time. Was evident in recruitment, access, and outreach programs that intentionally work with communities, families, and elders to engage in culturally relevant curricula and programming. And this included STEM programs that supported Indigenous students in their academics, quote, without compromising their culture, unquote, often in their own communities. Historically, Native fraternities and sororities were developed to strengthen community within settler colonial environments of universities. Other programs like the Pueblo Doctoral Cohort and the Native American Leadership and Education Doctoral Cohort program centered IKS to support students. And the literature continues to support the importance of family and relationships for Indigenous students. Indigenous leadership, Indigenous sisterhood, motherhood in the academy, Indigenous statistics, and measurement inventories were also centered in IKS. Okay. So before we move to the content of the book, in Kirkness and Barnhart's 1991 foundational work, who's familiar with Kirkness and Barnhart and the 4 R's? Okay, one hand, some nodding, 2, 3, okay. They stated that students attend university for reasons that transcend the interest and well-being of the individual student. Indigenous students desire the 4 R's: respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility for themselves and their communities. Desire is agentive. Consider the 4 R's as actions. Some scholars have added an additional R for relationality. So some chapters, I think we go to the next one. Okay. We've timed this well. Use the 4 and 5 R's as frameworks. Others have used Gaudry and Lauren's 2018 spectrum of indigenization. So the first and very easy level of indigenization is Indigenous inclusion. So that's you hire some Indigenous faculty or staff, and you expect magic to happen after that. Reconciliation indigenization is an epistemological integration. So you have these new people you've hired, so you have some new courses that you offer. Decolonial indigenization is indigenous autonomy. So earlier when I talked about self-determination and sovereignty, that's where we would have control over courses and curriculums and frameworks. So the authors ask, and us ask, that you consider their chapters as gifts, and that's you. Okay.
So as we look at revisiting Beyond the Asterisk and this anniversary expanded edition, we've highlighted the chapters that have been included here. So we return to some of the previous chapters from Beyond the Asterisk, but we also added some new spaces. So I mentioned that when Beyond the Asterisk was first dreamed into existence, we weren't able to cover everything. There were a number of issues and topics that hadn't arisen yet, or that we quite frankly overlooked, and that required reflection from us. But in the 12 chapters that are here, we return to the first year experience with Shelley Lowe and John Little. And then we return to Steve Martin, who in the original book talked about the sacred hoop model in student affairs, so centering Indigenous knowledge and culture in student affairs practices. And so he expanded on this in this new edition. And then revisiting historically Native American fraternity and sororities with updated scholarship and research. We also revisited tribal college collaborations with Cheryl Crazy Bull and Justin Guillory, who is now originally was working at a tribal college and is now the president of Northwest Indian College. And then return to professional association developments. And I think what was important in this chapter was returning to the work that has happened in student affairs and higher education associations and professional organizations, and the spaces that have been reclaimed for Indigenous people within those organizations. And so what emerged as new, what we wanted to make sure that were the new development pieces in this edition were these 7 chapters here. So Stephanie mentioned this issue of data and the representation of Indigenous students, particularly in national data sets. And so we were able to incorporate from Dr. Jameson Lopez new work that has emerged on Indigenous statistics or Indigenous student data. And he and his co-author do a beautiful job of examining and exploring what it means to think about statistics, to think about data through an Indigenous lens, and how do we center Indigenous knowledges in that practice, and what does that mean? And I think that this has been a critical development in the last not 10 years, but really in the last 5 years that this work has emerged. One of the things that we didn't include in Beyond the Asterisk was voices of our Indigenous brothers and sisters, particularly Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students. And we have found throughout our work such connections amongst us. And so it was important to center that voice or those voices in this expanded edition. Indigenous men in higher education. So you notice from the statistics, if we go back, the representation of Indigenous, people who identify as women amongst Indigenous students from 60% to 65% over the last 10 years. And so there has been work that has centered those voices. There has been important work about the experiences of Indigenous women in higher education, Indigenous motherhood, Indigenous women scholars. And what has been missing from there, from the scholarship, has been a conversation about our Indigenous students who identify as men. What are their experiences? What is happening in those spaces? And so there have been a, a few dissertations in recent years that have come out of well, from some of our students, one at University of Oklahoma and Syracuse, who have been writing about Indigenous men and their experiences in college. And so it was important for us to address the space of gender with Indigenous students. Stephanie mentioned, as we talk about definitions, understanding the impositions on Indigenous people around LGBTQIA plus identities. And a really critical missing piece for us when we originally explored Beyond the Asterisk was a conversation and the voices of LGBTQIA plus and Two-Spirit relatives. And so in this expanded edition, there is a chapter that addresses relationship and kinship in supporting Indigenous Two-Spirit and LGBTQ plus students in higher education. Another piece that has come out and a lot of the scholarship has been this notion of giving back. So this framing of the 4 R's and the 5 R's in terms of Indigenous student experiences in higher education, this particularly this value of reciprocity and relationality has come up over and over. And there's been critical work to examine what giving back looks like for Indigenous students, what giving back for Indigenous college students means, and how we work to serve Indigenous students and how we understand motivations for going to college. And so Jameson Lopez and Nicole Reyes write from their work about notions of giving back, of reciprocity. And then while in the first edition, or the original Beyond the Asterisk, we talked about this new role that was emerging at the time of the special advisor on college campuses, particularly the special advisor on Indigenous affairs or tribal relations to presidents. I believe you have such a position here at University of Illinois, other institutions like University of Arizona, Arizona State University, University of Oklahoma, Colorado State, now University of Colorado, Syracuse, a number of institutions of the last 10 or 15 years have instituted these positions of a special advisor, particularly acknowledging the unique role and status of tribal nations as sovereign nations and the important role of an advisor to connect institutions, particularly our public institutions, to tribal nations. So Karen Francis Begay wrote about that as one of the long-standing people that hold these positions at the University of Arizona, and the work that she had done. She revisits that in this new book. But part of what we didn't talk about and we felt was really important to address was this idea of partnerships. What do true partnerships that are reciprocal between universities and colleges and tribal nations or tribal communities look like? And so Chris Nelson and Robin Minthorn and Teresa Stewart talk about this, what they term as heart work. So that work that comes from the heart, from a place that centers what is critical to us as Indigenous people and cultivating reciprocal relationships and partnerships between tribal nations and communities and universities. And then finally, a really important piece that arose out of all of these community spaces that have been created in professional organizations has been this creation of Indigenous student affairs standards and guidelines. And so Dr. Waterman, along with colleagues, explore what that looked like, why it was important to create these standards among student affairs practitioners for serving Indigenous students in higher education. And so these were really important additions in this expanded anniversary edition that we felt were important for us to explore. And I think we note over and over again that no book, no scholarship is ever meant to be complete. It's never meant to cover every topic. It was an important lesson that we learned, and an important, a point of pressure when you have such limited scholarship. When we originally brought scholars together for Beyond the Asterisk, was how do we cover everything that we feel like we need to cover? How do we address every issue? And the answer is we don't. And we never really intended to. That this was supposed to be an invitation into starting the conversation. And that was the hope. And I think that it is what we have realized over the years, is that that original meeting that happened here, the creation of that book and that scholarship sparked critical conversations that sparked dissertations to address Indigenous men in higher education, that sparked conversations about giving back, and sparked spaces and created spaces for emerging Indigenous scholars to explore the critical issues that we continue to face in higher education. And so we continue to acknowledge that this isn't meant to be a final conversation. This is always conceived of as an invitation for people to join into the conversation. And so acknowledging all of that, even with these 7 new chapters and additions to this work, that there's no way that we're ever going to, and we're not meant to. Our knowledge is not complete. The conversation doesn't end. And so we acknowledge that we don't cover everything. And what we hope is that people pick up this conversation and join in. And so the authors that have contributed to this new work offer a number of recommendations, or really what we talk about as gifts. So rather than making recommendations about what institutions should do or what practitioners should do, we move away from this kind of notion of recommendations and think about the gifts of knowledge, the gifts of story that authors are offering to the reader and to our communities. And so through that, they offer these really important gifts for us to carry forward from the book. And so we highlight here a few that really the gifts that thread across all of the chapters and all of the knowledge and the stories that are shared. And that first gift is the invitation to celebrate our students, to celebrate our communities, to celebrate one another, and to celebrate knowledge sharing. This invitation for us to be in community and to celebrate the gifts, the strengths, and the knowledges that we bring to our institutions and to these spaces, and how critical that is. The other gift is this invitation to include Indigenous communities in the work that we do, and to center Indigenous knowledge systems. And Dr. Waterman talked a lot about the importance of centering IKS and what that means to write from an Indigenous perspective for Indigenous audiences, and why that is such a true gift to be able to do that in a space within a span of time that it was really difficult to do just 15 years ago, because Indigenous knowledge systems weren't valued. And so this gift of an invitation to include Indigenous voices and knowledges. And this third gift of including Indigenous scholars and knowledge holders who do this work. Not all of our knowledge holders are faculty. They're not all academics, but they are all scholars in their own right. Some of them are, we've just talked about frontline workers. Some of them are community members. Many of them are elders. Many of them are, as my sister Shar talks about, elders in training, right? That we hold different spaces in our communities and with one another. And so including those Indigenous scholars in all of their forms and those that hold critical knowledges is such a gift. So this takes time. It takes time to build trust. It means that we must first listen. We have to be willing to learn, and we have to be willing to listen more than we talk in these spaces. The role of families are so critical as we think about knowledge holders and the different spaces that the Indigenous scholars occupy. Our students are scholars. Our students bring knowledge with them. Their families have imbued knowledge and teachings that that have existed far beyond any of us. And so those families are important. And so it's so critical to involve families and create valued relationships with the families of our Indigenous students. And then fourth, recognizing and including multiple perspectives. So really moving away from this notion of being experts, right? Not claiming, if you ever hear an Indigenous person describe themselves as an expert, you should probably question what's going on. So, but we do have, as Indigenous people who occupy these spaces and our own experiences, our own worldviews, then we bring a particular knowledge and experience to different spaces. And so acknowledging and including multiple perspectives. You've heard Stephanie talk about even just the identity of Indigenous students, what that might mean. Someone who is a citizen of a tribal nation, someone who has grown up within their community, rooted in traditional practices, some who may be reconnecting, right? Settler colonialism impacts all of us. And so that means that our identities vary. It means that our perspectives and experiences vary. And so it's really important to recognize and include all of those varied perspectives, all of those varied experiences, and understand that Indigenous students are not a monolith. And we have to value all of the different knowledges that they bring with them. And while I will say, be careful of people who claim to be experts, what we can say is that we are all experts of our own experience. And so trusting and hearing from our students and community members who are understand better than anyone else their own experiences. And then I think the final gift is a reminder for all of us to learn, to understand, and to follow protocols. And to understand that those protocols exist differently across different communities. And so that takes time. It takes patience. It takes humility to learn those protocols, even as Indigenous people. As someone who is a visitor on land that is not my traditional homelands, I have to always learn the protocols of the tribal nations whose land I'm a visitor upon, right? I have to learn what those protocols are. It requires, again, a certain humility. It requires a willingness to engage the knowledges and the experiences and the stories and histories of people up in place. And so learning those, being willing to follow them and upholding them is critical, and recognizing that they are often vastly different from the protocols that exist within our institutions. And so I think that is probably one of the more important gifts that our authors offer. And so I think one of the pieces that we leave with, and we leave you with, or invite you to consider as you think about Indigenous students and Indigenous people in higher education spaces, is what future is being created for Indigenous students when institutions critically engage the ideas and topics that are gifted here in this anniversary edition, in this expanded edition. What future is being created when we engage with the gifts and the topics and ideas that are being gifted by Indigenous scholars that invite us to think about our responsibilities, to place responsibilities to people, responsibility to Indigenous communities and Indigenous students. And then, and so we have some time here for some questions. And, but we want to ask all of you to take just a few minutes before we get into questions and just turn to your partner, or if you want to get up and walk to another table. Yeah. So I want you to reflect on this question And take just a few minutes and talk with your partner about what does it mean? What futures are we creating for Indigenous students when institutions critically engage ideas and topics about serving Indigenous students?
I didn't know who that person was either.
Hear the murmur start to like die down a little bit. It sounds like there's a lot of really good conversation. If we could come back together, does anyone want to share or gift us with what you talked about? So in your groups or in your partners, anything that folks want to share about what future is being created when institutions critically engage with these ideas and topics? Oh, now y'all are quiet. Yes. We're actually seeing hopefully structural changes that actually do something to the longevity of our existence and generations to come, and hopefully, be prevented. So I know that like the community fight a lot, and the community we're very drowned out with attitudes for ourselves and so and I think it's because we've grown up the system that is inherently opposite of what we consider that really creating projects when you verify they don't have a choice but to actually express the fundamental questions that thank you. That's important. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
About Stephanie Russo Carroll from Herbert, and she talks about the business of it. And I think that if people are engaging with the gifts that the authors are providing, then I would hope that would lead to a more respectful with indigenous students also.
Yeah, absolutely. What about?
It's something that I often talk to you both about. And oftentimes, as an Indigenous person at a historically white institution, the topics and ideas that we introduce are often viewed as bringing imbalance to a conversation, when in fact, what we seek to do is bringing balance back to a campus landscape, because these ideas and topics have been systematically removed from literature, from history, and then, the institutions even view these ideas and topics as gifts. Because what this question is saying to me is, you're interrogating the institution from an Indigenous lens, because oftentimes in these classroom spaces and our respective fields, we're socialized and conditioned to interrogate Indigenous from the Western side.
Mm-hmm.
So this is really asking everyone to center indigeneity, and that can feel uncomfortable. It can really engender some feelings of maybe disequilibria, something that we experience often on the daily. And they're asked to just kind of sit in that for a moment and just get a tiny taste of what our participation is often.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Anyone else? Well, thank you for that. I think those are important in considerations, particularly as we think about what does it mean when we shift how we're viewing this? What does it mean when we shift not just our thinking and the question, but our way of being and existing in these spaces? So what does it mean then to create different futures, new futures that really engage with indigeneity, that engage with Indigenous knowledge systems? And what futures is that creating for Indigenous students, for Indigenous communities? And what kind of hopeful futures is that creating for our institutions? How do we reimagine these spaces? So thank you for the engagement and indulging us in that conversation.
Can you put the chapters back up? So did any one of these chapters spark a question for you for disruption? Now that we've had this whole conversation, is there anything in there that makes you think, oh, I can make a change in my department or class or work? Mhm. Awesome.
Yeah, so one question I have, I think it kind of comes from this book, but also, so I was at Dr. Shotton's talk when she came in before the pandemic, and I was, at that time, I had just started my PhD and I was working in student affairs, in a unit within student affairs. And I remember being so impressed by your talk, and I got your book, and I was like, this is amazing, and I want to implement so much of this. I was the graduate student in charge of assessment and research data for this unit. So I tried to start implementing some of the suggestions that were in the book, and I got pushback from my supervisor. And so I guess one question that I have, like, what is your advice to someone? I'm not native, so, but I would consider myself like how I would consider it. So what would be your advice to someone who's trying to do that with happened?
Yeah, a couple things. So administration does like literature and data. So there is a book, Gavin Henning is one of the editors on assessment. Social just assessment or something. Henning, Henning. So there are many examples in there of how to disrupt traditional assessment, like going beyond grades and numbers and things like that, like really questioning what does participation mean in engagement. The CAS standards, Council for Advancement of Standards in Higher Ed or something. So there's a whole bunch of standards and levels within that document that many student affairs master's programs are based on. It costs money to get the standards and to use them. So Symphony Oxendine, me, Rob, Hancock, Corey, Bazemore James, and somebody else were asked by Gavin Henning to work on these standards. But what was really important about that is there are now standards written for Indigenous student affairs based on research. And if somebody starts to question, I can't do this, well, here is the standard of the entire profession, and we have these levels that you can follow and use. And partner. I mean, you can find other people on campus who are like-minded, and maybe even at other campuses or in the community.
And here's my response as a now administrator is say, push back. When you get pushed back, keep pushing back. But I think it's also in those conversations, so Charlotte talked about like this need for discomfort and disequilibrium and what folks are often experiencing. But if we think about it, that discomfort is necessary for change. And so oftentimes I ask simple questions that frame what is really going on. So why is that acceptable? Why is it acceptable? Why is it okay for our institution to XYZ? How does thinking about from an assessment standpoint or whatever it might be, how does this make our institution better? Whose perspectives are we excluding? Whose voices are not only excluded but dismissed? And why is it acceptable to dismiss those voices? And how does this not serve our institution and our mission? So taking it back to what is the mission and what it is that we aim to do in our institutions, and framing those questions, that, the discomfort piece is important, right? As with all growth. Yeah. Other questions? Mhm.
That's probably what it's not the right word,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm. Youth space. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You're still grappling with the asterisk? Yeah. Well, and the way that we utilize data, really not utilize, but we weaponize data, particularly with Indigenous communities and Indigenous students. We weaponize it by writing Indigenous people out and designating the asterisk of, ends not big enough, population's too small. Or in this case, we can't, they're not underrepresented, so they don't deserve services. Or even the way that we, from a retention standpoint, and I have these conversations often about how we're presenting the data on retention and how we're framing those conversations, the way that we weaponize these notions of Native students not being college ready, right? So there's another chapter that talks about creating a Native ready campus. But even the way that we frame the question or frame the conversation around data and think about the weaponization of data. Again, it's a further example of the ongoing settler colonial agenda, right? It's another way to erase, and I think calling that out is really important in those conversations to say. So why is it important to, or how does it serve us to erase an entire population of students? And how are we weaponizing this to cause harm? I also think about institutions that, does an institution have a land acknowledgement statement? And if so, then part of those practice, it's not just the statement, it's the practices that come along with that. So how are we upholding our responsibilities to this place and the people of this place if we are not serving them? And so going back to the kind of performative actions that institutions take and upholding the responsibilities to that. So we can't just write a statement, we can't post it, and we can't read it. We have to actually act on it. And part of that action is making sure that we're being responsible to those communities.
A lot of the chapters had a little history in the beginning, in their introductions. The Native Hawaiian, yeah, yeah. So what they have a really interesting map, a figure in there about the changes in identification, the overthrow of the kingdom, what happened after that, Indigenous men, how over time settler colonialism has changed the roles violently. But this place has a history. And when we were here in 2006, the mascot had just been sort of removed. It was everywhere, right? So it was really very hostile. I'm sure you remember what that was like. There was violence. physical violence on campus about that. So okay, I encourage you all to bring that history, look it up, and once you publish it and put it in their face, when you try to do these initiatives, you might get a different reaction. You know, things are different now with history across the nation, but every institution has a personal history and connection to the people and the land here. And I think that's been buried for a very long time. Like, try to find out who owned the property that this building is on originally. It's really hard to find these things. But every place has a history, and I think it's really important to find that and keep it somewhere so that you can use it when you're challenging some of these policies. And there are many examples in this book.
Other, we have other questions? Or comment? What's words?
Now it's quiet.
Well, with that, I think that, the hope is that, the hope is that this work invites you to reflect, to pause, and that it generates more questions and answers. Because as long as we're asking the questions, then we're engaging the conversation. And it takes folks who are co-conspirators, who are in different spaces, to ask those questions and to push those conversations. Because I'll say, most often it's Indigenous people that we're not in the room, we're not at the table or in those conversations. While we celebrate the growth we've experienced over the last 10 years, that's still, it's still a challenge that we face. And so having people that are willing to engage those questions and conversations and push back is really important. And so we invite you to continue to engage the conversation. We've talked about this new expanded anniversary edition of Developments Beyond the Asterisk, that it's available on November 10th for pre-order. You can order through Rutledge, and it will be shipped December 1st. So we invite you to continue to engage the conversation, to join our fellow scholars and authors who really do offer important gifts for all of us, and how we think about continuing to shape our future, and a future in higher education that that reimagines this space as one that centers Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledge, and that restores balance from centuries of harm that have been inflicted on Indigenous students in these very spaces. And so invite you to join that conversation and the gifts that help us to reimagine that future.
So I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Just quickly, I'd like to invite David and Yanaba up. So in the spirit of reciprocity, on behalf of the Native American House, we wanted to gift you each with some just small gestures of gratitude. So thank you.